afternoon, everyone. I believe we are about ready to begin. My name is Trace Mitchell, and I have the pleasure of serving as Policy Counsel for NetChoice. NetChoice is a technology-focused trade association dedicated to the principles of free enterprise and free expression. I am incredibly excited about today's event as it deals with some of the most important issues facing the world of antitrust and the online economy. Apps and the stores that distribute them are how we entertain ourselves, connect with others, and get the work done that we need in this increasingly digital world. You can find them everywhere, on your smartphone, computer, video game console, and even on your television set. But in recent years, some policymakers and developers have started to question whether these app stores are abusing competitors and the power that they have obtained. Are app stores gatekeepers? Or do these walled gardens help ensure that users and developers have affordable, trustworthy options by covering the cost of upkeep, imposing safety checks, engaging in transaction fees, cloud storage, and a variety of other services? Does this model protect consumers and build user trust, or is it just a way to exploit small businesses and customers for a quick buck? Today's panel will cover these issues and more. Without further ado, let's jump right in. Our panel today consists of 3 experts working diligently to address these issues and answer these questions. Our first panelist is Graham Dufault. Graham is the Senior Director of Public Policy at the Association for Competitive Technology, more commonly known as the App Association. He leads the App Association's legislative initiatives on behalf of 5,000 small mobile software and connected device companies in the app economy. He is certainly plugged into this world. Our next panelist is Jessica Melugin. Jessica is the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. She researches technology issues including antitrust, online privacy, internet taxation, telecommunications, social media content, and net neutrality regulation, as well as app stores. Our final panelist, but certainly not least, is Eric Peterson. Eric is the director of the Pelican Center for Technology and Innovation at the Pelican Institute for Public Policy. He works on a variety of issues there related to tech, specifically ones that are relevant to Louisiana, including state-level app store bills. Prior to Pelican, Eric worked on state policy for a variety of organizations, including Americans for Prosperity and the Institute for Free Speech. Our first question will go to Graham. When we say app stores, what do we really mean? We all have them on our phones, but how do these app stores currently function? Do they all have a similar model, or are there a variety of different approaches employed by these various app stores?
There's a couple of questions in there, and they're really good questions, and they're interrelated, and they're very relevant because they're foundational to sort of how policymakers are trying to address what they perceive as the harms in this area. So when we talk about app stores in testimony in front of Congress or the state legislatures, we've always sort of distinguished software platforms from social media, search, and retail platforms, because usually what they're trying to do is figure out how antitrust works in the context of markets characterized by the entry of big platforms that are really kind of two-sided markets. And so software platforms are no exception. And app stores we view as sort of one of the main components of a software platform. If you think about the suite of services that app developers, my member companies, purchase from app stores, it's sort of part and parcel with the operating system. So to give you an example, our member companies for a long time have agitated for app stores to quickly remove apps that either steal their content or pump up their ratings so that they appear higher up and are basically fraudsters. Now, it's up to the app stores to remove those bad actors, but it falls to the operating system to enforce that decision. And so when you think about the suite of services that the member companies purchase, it's sort of a combination of those two things, and that constitutes sort of a software platform, and it distinguishes it from social media platforms where the business model is super different. So that's a big part of it. That's a big part of the developer side of the two-sided market, and it also helps explain why it's so sort of self-defeating to prohibit an app store from preventing side loading, which is the downloading of unapproved software or unapproved app stores that the software platform hasn't reviewed. So, and that is what a bunch of state legislatures and Congress, albeit in different ways, are proposing, and the bills would hurt the member companies because, again, our member companies pay the software platforms to remove bad actors. That's a huge part of the set of services that they get. So that's an app store is a major component of a software platform, which the member companies leverage as a trusted marketplace to acquire customers and clients. And so to your second question, about what are the differences between how they operate, looking specifically at the side loading question. For example, iOS says, categorically disallows side-loaded software. It says if it's unapproved and the App Store hasn't approved it, iOS isn't going to allow it on an iOS device. Android disallows side loading by default, but the current version and recent versions say you can go into the settings and enable side loading from one at a time from certain sources. And the member companies also say you got to go through more of a ringer when it comes to privacy, and there are more boxes to check on privacy if you want to be a developer on iOS and you want to get software approved on iOS. So there are a couple of things that sort of distinguish the Android marketplace and the Google Play Store from the App Store in the iOS ecosystem. The ultimate result is that consumers who want to be able to customize a little more, care not as much about privacy and security, and really just want variety. Those folks are more likely to go to Android, and people whose primary concern is privacy and security and ease of use for a less sophisticated user in particular, like myself, they're probably more likely to go with Apple and iOS. But I'll say though that Android's allowance, that the ability to go into the settings and say I want to side load software, it's not unaffected by all these state bills and some of the congressional proposals. Android maintains the ability to refuse unapproved software and issues alerts for consumers when they make that decision to allow side loading. For example, in that recent FTC complaint and then the consent order, where they went after the stalkerware app SpyPhone, the FTC found it very, very relevant that SpyPhone had to walk the purchasers through all these steps to ignore all the warnings from Android saying, if you allow side loading, you could open up your device to greater risk of privacy and security intrusions. That was very relevant to the FTC. Some of these non-discrimination bills and others that we're going to be talking about would create a presumption of illegality for warnings like that, in the name of pure competition, or in order to sort of lower the costs for some of the actors on the platform like Spotify and Match Group and others that sell digital only goods and services. So I'll stop there, but hopefully that kind of creates the context and wasn't too long of an answer to a really good question.
Not at all, Graham. That is some awesome context. I know I use my iPhone because when I load it up, I want all the apps to work together. As somebody who may work on tech policy, I am certainly not tech savvy. And so I just want the simplest, easy to use system possible. But that brings up another good point. So far we focus primarily on phones, but are there app stores on other devices? And if so, how does that intersect with this area of the technological environment, Graham?
Yeah, it's it's a good question. I think there's people call it sort of walled garden approach that Apple has taken, and more of an open approach that Android has taken. And so I think there is competitive differentiation is something that I will point out, and that there are two sides to the market. There's a side of the market where a software platform is trying to attract customers, and there's a side of the market where the platform is trying to attract developers. And so you've naturally seen that there's a differentiation in those sets of services. There's no reason to suggest that video game app stores are fundamentally different. And in fact, they compete directly now more so than ever on attracting consumers and attracting developers. So the market is not just iOS. The market is not just Android apps. The market is a little more complex and dynamic than something as simple as that.
I think that's a great point. Eric, I'm going to kick it over to you. People often refer to these app stores as gatekeepers. What does this mean, and what are its implications for the area of antitrust?
Yeah, thanks, Trace. I mean, I think when people are talking about gatekeepers, right, you obviously can't get on the Android or Apple App Store without going through a process. And that process is to make sure that you're not having your privacy stolen, that you're not having your credit card stolen, the app actually does what it says, that it doesn't cause problems with the iOS system. But I think as Graham points out, it's important to think about app stores as bigger than just what you have on your iPad or my Google Pixel phone. I use a lot of different app stores. I use Steam on my computer, which I play most of my games on, but not all games are on Steam. Some of them have to go through EA Origin stores. I also have a Nintendo Switch, which I have to go through and buy games on there. And obviously, those video game developers have to come to some sort of agreement with Nintendo in order to be on there. Sometimes the same games are on multiple app stores. Sometimes they're not. When it comes to implications for antitrust, I think the best thing we can look at right now is the Epic versus Apple decision, where the judge actually said the relevant market isn't just apps or app stores. What actually is looking at is the market for video game apps, because that's a lot about what we're talking here. When we're talking about the revenue, which we'll get into later, most of that is driven by virtual purchases in video game apps. And both Apple has a app store, obviously on their mobile devices, but Epic also runs a game store where you can go on your PC or again Nintendo Switch and buy that product there as well. So market definitions are always tricky, especially when they're antitrust. Oftentimes they're the whole ball game. But when we look at who's the sort of gatekeeper for being able to purchase what, sometimes we have to look at what device are you talking about.
I think building on that question, a lot of people would maybe push back on that and say, well, because you have one phone and say, Apple's the only phone you have, they really are a gatekeeper. People might be able to go to their PC and play on Steam, as you mentioned, for other games, but when they're on their phone, really Apple has the control there, and that's what makes them a gatekeeper. Do you think that's a fair analysis, or do you think that even on maybe a singular device, there are various options?
I mean, it's difficult to say, right? If we're looking at the Apple versus Epic case, right? Fortnite is available on, I think, at least a dozen platforms, and your account can transfer over. So what you're buying on Fortnite are skins or various other customization options. If you go buy it on your PC, it shows up on your iPhone as well. So there's no reason to think that you're sort of locked in that way. Certainly, if a game is only available on iOS, then yeah, there is sort of a different approach there. But they're very fact-intensive cases when you're talking about what these apps actually look like. And I think that's a lot of the trouble with making broad proclamations about antitrust, looking at one app or one game versus an app store.
I think those are important points. Jessica, I want to pull you into this conversation. So Eric mentioned the Epic versus Apple and Epic versus Google lawsuits that have been in the news all over the place. You see them everywhere. What are these lawsuits about? Can you walk us through it and provide a little ground laying?
Yeah, and I kind of want to talk about not the cause of these lawsuits, but sort of the reason why they're more relevant to us. We're seeing them more in the media because they play into sort of a larger backdrop, right? Which is the tech lash and the pushback against a lot of these big tech companies, and also a real enthusiasm for antitrust action in general, state, federal, everyone is interested these days. So I think that's part of the reason why these are getting more coverage maybe than they normally would. But to walk through the case, Apple versus Epic, I categorize as tech on tech violence. And we can talk about the merits of the case, but I think probably most people who are on here are familiar, but just very briefly, Epic decided against the contract they had entered into with the Apple App Store that they were going to offer their own in-app payment system and cut out Apple's fee. And because they broke the rules, they got kicked out of the playground, and they decided to run to the playground supervisor instead and file a lawsuit and say, this is unfair that they're asking us to do this, even though we agreed to do this in return for the enormous amount of distribution and other benefits to consumers. And then recently, the courts weighed in and said, yeah, well, you broke the rules and they're allowed to do that. And there was a little caveat to that that had to do with the California state consumer law that's not totally relevant here and was sort of more in line with concessions that Apple was already starting to make. But the point is that, if you want to play in the App Store garden, you have to play by their rules. And I hate to be boring about it, but this is my job to be boring. This is, for us, the CI, this is a property rights issue. And this is Apple's App Store. And if you don't like it, as Eric has pointed out, there are many other places to go sell your wares. But these are the terms and conditions that Apple sets, and they come with costs for developers, I'm sure, on some level. But as Graham points out, they come with a lot of benefits. And for consumers, they certainly come with benefits. And consumers also have a choice about what phones they use, so what app stores they're apt to use. And this is sort of like, more of a freedom of association in terms of business contracts issue than it is some big antitrust smoking gun. But again, in the backdrop of a real resurgence of interest about antitrust and a lot of anger at these tech companies about other things, I think these issues kind of get mixed together and jumbled up, and we end up doing panels about them, which is great and fun. But maybe that wouldn't be the case without everything else going on in the background.
Jessica, you kind of highlighted that this is more of a business transactional, a contract issue than it is anything else. So what is Epic seeking in this case? What is their goal, and what would this ultimately mean for consumers?
Well, I think that part of Epic's goal, which they've been really successful about, is getting a lot of publicity and cashing in on a lot of the anger some people have towards these tech companies. I think it's a great PR campaign, because the day they filed the lawsuit, they were ready with a really snazzy, but very inside baseball, nerd reference kind of PR campaign and video that day. And I think that part of it is them still sort of playing in the marketplace a little bit. I'll give them credit for that. They've gotten a lot of publicity on this, but what they want is to be able to offer an alternative in-app payment system and not go through the Apple payment. And they also want things surrounding that, right? The ability to contact their customers, which they might get a little bit of from the California ruling. But just in the last 24 hours, Epic's founder and CEO has been complaining that even though Apple said if they just wanted to come back and play by the rules, that they would be able to, and now Apple's saying, actually, about that time you sued us, we're not going to let you back in until all of this legal stuff is resolved. And I don't think that's unreasonable, because Epic kind of wants it both ways, right? They want to be able to still benefit from the App Store distribution and the trust that the App Store has established with consumers, but they kind of want to pick and choose when they want to play by those rules of that App Store. And then, I think that it's probably a little offensive to be sued, I would imagine. And I'm not sure that Apple's really that anxious to get back in bed with Epic after all of this. Now, the opportunity to continue to make money off of them might take over eventually, and I'm all for that. I'm a good capitalist. But I think that they want a lot of the upside of the App Store system, and they don't want to play by the rules. And I think if you look at it like that, I don't think it's that difficult for people to understand, what really is at the crux of this, right? There's real benefits to that App Store, and you chip away at those if you start to pick away at the privacy and the convenience and all those things that the rules kind of set up. I think there's a trade-off there. People never like to hear that. It's another parental thing I'll say on the panel. This is about trade-offs. And that doesn't go away even if you kind of try to come in and bring the lever of government to bear.
I think that's a great point. It was a wise man who said that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so, Jessica, I want to build on that a little bit because you're talking about this trust that the app stores have developed over time and these privacy and security protections and how Epic's sort of trying to have it both ways. What do you mean when you say trust and when you talk about the privacy protections? What are these platforms doing, and why do you think some of these proposals might cut back on that?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that Graham can talk about it in more detail because he works with these guys every day. So I'll be really interested to hear his comments. But briefly, I would just say, part of, those rules exist, whether they are worth it to you or not, whether you decide to be an Apple iOS person or you would like the convenience of side loading that Google products and Android products offer, there's upsides to that too. But the bundle of benefits here that Apple's saying, this is what we've made our competitive advantage. This is our brand, right? If you think about Apple, it's privacy, it's security. And on the consumer side, it's also convenience, right? You're not dealing with a million different third-party in-app people who could be, I don't know who they could be on the other side of the world, and maybe I don't have legal recourse if something goes wrong. There's I think we've all heard from our IT people at work who don't use Apple products that those of us who do are sort of brainless. And it's true. I choose to be brainless on my Apple device. I like that someone else has figured out and checked the privacy, the security. I like that I have one place to go and cancel a service. I totally cop to that, right? Because that's a trade-off I've made. I'm not as tech savvy as some, and that will be different for each person, and that's fine. It's not like Google's not doing all right, right? They've put forth a different approach, and they're very successful as well. But I think when you want the customer base of people like me with Apple, but then you want to start picking away at why people like me have picked Apple, there's a tension there, right? And Epic is looking to sort of cash in on that, but that's not, the marketplace suggests that that's not where the inflection point is. But again, Graham will have more specifics, but that's, I think there's a tension.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Jessica, and that one of the litmus tests that our member companies have is whether or not a consumer feels comfortable enough in a given environment to download software from a company they hadn't heard of before. So are they willing to experiment with a couple of different apps and try them all out, and then the one that's the best is the one that they keep, and they delete the other two, for example. In the current environment, that's exactly what they're experiencing right now. Is our member company Vmos, just because they don't have big brand name recognition, doesn't mean that people won't download their software because they trust the ecosystem. They know that this is not likely to have malware. It's not likely that the app does a bunch of things that it doesn't say it's going to do. And all these things are sort of built in to the ecosystem. They don't have to think about that. Now, if you put all of that gating sort of function on the consumer, and suddenly they have to do all of this research on their own, they're just going to default to software made by big name companies like Epic Games and Match Group and Spotify. It's going to be an even greater advantage to really big companies. That's part of the reason those companies are pushing these proposals, because they don't have nearly as much to lose as app association members, because they depend a lot more. My member companies depend a lot more heavily on the trustworthiness of the ecosystem in general, because again, they don't have name recognition. They depend on the ecosystem itself.
Eric, I'm going to kick it over to you because Jessica brought up something that's really important, and that's the state level policies, right? And so, your work is primarily focused in Louisiana. And this past year, both Arizona, Louisiana, and several other states considered bills that would somewhat impact these app ecosystems. Can you speak a little bit about the bills?
Yeah, essentially the bills, in broad general terms, right? They're all a little bit different. States always draft these things a little bit different to do with our code, but they would have allowed two things. One is that they would have allowed side loading, essentially that you can download whatever app you wanted to on your phone. And secondly, that you couldn't impose a default payment method for running your app stores. Now, some of these were written a little more tightly, so it would have only hit like the iOS and Android operating system, some of which were written a little bit more loosely and would have gotten things like Steam or the Xbox Store, or the Microsoft Store, or the PlayStation Store, or pick whatever other app stores are out there. There's a bunch of them, mostly again related to video gaming. We had a real problem with these bills on a few levels. One is, I think Jessica hit on some of the trade-offs that come with imposing a one-size-fits-all policy. The other is that states are sort of running these bills, and the problem when you pass these bills, I'm a big believer in federalism, but if you're doing it at the state level, you impose lots of different costs on developers as they're trying to run app stores or apps among 50 different states. And if you start running into 50 different rules, it's especially going to hurt companies like Graham's companies who are just trying to figure out how to get on, the App Store to begin with. So this is, one of those times that I'm not suggesting that, we pass a federal solution to this, but it's certainly something that is more well suited to the federal government than for states to sort of impose these different restrictions on companies that, frankly, are not just in the United States, but across the world. I know people play Fortnite or use dating apps, in dozens of different countries. Spotify is a Swedish company, for example.
I think that's a good point, and tees up another question I have, which is recently we saw the Open App Markets Act be introduced federally. Can you speak a little bit about this? And do you think that this sort of solves the concerns you have or raises similar concerns?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly raises similar concerns to the trade-off that Jessica said. I would add in one other is that it has a threshold of 50 million users of the App Store to sort of trigger the requirements of it. And again, that is the third-party payment, also, allowing for side loading. I think it sets these really weird artificial barriers when you're starting to deal with growth. It doesn't, get in a few video game app stores, but it starts to answer the question of like, what do you do if you do have a video game console that gets to that, and you're really directing the point of the bill to mobile operating systems, or would it affect Microsoft's App Store? Obviously, we're all getting a new Windows update, and they have an App Store on there. There's a good reason to have an App Store on your PC. Your PC is very, very customizable. That's always a thing it had over sort of the Apple PCs, right? You can run hundreds of thousands of different programs, presumably. But oftentimes, you get a blue screen of death, or you download some program and it doesn't work right, and you get a virus. So Microsoft is trying to, deal with that problem by opening up an app store that is similar to what people recognize on their mobile device, and sort of port that model of trust and security over to the PC world. And obviously, that's good for some people like my parents. I like to customize my PC a little bit more than they do. So, I'll probably not use that. I'll go directly to the website and try out some different stuff. But it goes to show that there's value in both of those models, and trying to impose a one-size-fits-all, and especially make it difficult to scale by putting some artificial threshold in there, is going to be really difficult.
Eric, I'm going to stay with you for just a second, only because we've had an audience question that's directed specifically towards you. And it's about this sort of walled garden idea. If an entity does have sort of a more walled garden approach and imposes something like a 30% fee, which tends to be the standard rate, though Google has announced in the past year cuts to that rate in different areas, and they have, say, 47% of the smartphone market. Do you think it makes sense to augment the relevant market definition so it's just the device that it's on?
If I understand the question correctly, I think what they're asking is, does it make sense to just say, well, look, it's the Android market or it's the Apple market, to look at the broader smartphone market, or the PC market, or the mobile computing market is wrong? It's a difficult question, right? I mean, obviously the Apple versus Epic case gave us our first sort of insight into that. There's also an antitrust case against the Android App Store. In a lot of ways, it's weird to come up with these market definitions, because Apple is the dominant platform in the United States. They have something like 60% of the mobile market. But throughout the entire world, they're actually at something closer to 25%. Android is by far the dominant market. If you look at app store size. Samsung, for example, is incredibly popular over in Asia. And when you're looking at things like Epic Games, right, or any of the big video game or app stores or games, which I keep going back to this, but there's a reason I'm going back to this, is because they're actually the drivers of the revenue for a lot of these app stores, and it's in-app, in-game purchases. Most of the apps that for companies that Graham represent make all of their money just on ads. So I think, you know, defining those markets presents a very tricky challenge, and understanding who's using it, who's driving the revenue, and from where is going to put some interesting questions to antitrust in the courts.
Now, Graham, you actually represent these app developers themselves, and you mentioned how a lot of these proposals are driven by some of the largest app developers, and some of them, you know, benefit the large ones, but don't necessarily benefit the small ones in the same way. How would these proposals impact your members specifically, and what are some of their concerns individually that they may have about some of these proposals?
So there's a couple of ways that it would impact the member companies. You know, the most proximate impact could potentially be just shifting the costs down to smaller competitors like app association members. And then the secondary effect, and this might even be worse, is sort of the undermining of trustworthiness of the ecosystem. And we've talked about that a little bit, but you know, to the first point, there's a specific example I can point to where, you know, in the Arizona legislature, when they were debating one of these proposals, which would have required software platforms to allow side loading, one question arose in that debate. You know, well, you know, what if you make it easy for some of the big competitors like Spotify and Match Group to get out of paying the commission, which was kind of one of the root issues here. You know, how is an app store going to make up for that lost revenue? How is the software platform going to make up for that? And what happens to consumers? And one of the lawmakers that was a proponent of the bill said, and just sort of speaking off the cuff, well, you know, the app store should probably just, you know, what's the registration fee for all developers? $100? They should just increase that to $2,000, $3,000 or something like that. So what you had was a suggestion that the barrier to entry, the entry fee to be a developer on the ecosystem on the App Store, be increased 30-fold in order to serve the interests of the biggest, you know, sellers on the platform. That's kind of what the proponents of the bills want ultimately, is to make sure that they don't have to pay as much and that the smaller developers have to pay more. Now, if you increase the entry fee so directly, so like what I just described, the effect obviously is going to be to discourage entry, especially by really small players like 1 to 3 person companies. A lot of our member companies fit that profile. And people who are just looking to enter the market on a light budget and don't have a whole lot to spend on. You know, you have to hire a developer, $90,000, $100,000, and then, you know, the registration fee, which is annual. If it's $3,000 instead of $100, that's not an insignificant expense. So that's a pretty direct potential impact. I'm not saying that an app store necessarily is going to do that, but if you take commissions out of it, then, you know, what's the incentive to invest in the app store? What's the incentive to continuing that piece of the business? That's a real question that we have, and the impact on our member companies is probably going to be really negative. Now, the trust piece is something we talked about, but it can't be overstated. Where, you know, if you do prevent, you make it illegal or create a presumption of illegality, as sort of the Open App Markets Act would do, of preventing sideloading, then again, you sort of push all of the functions of trying to vet the software maker and trying to make sure it's a soft or a trustworthy company to buy from, because again, you're downloading the software onto a device where you have your most sensitive personal information. It's location, it's images, it's your emails, it's your messages. It's very, you know, more sensitive than ever, basically, a set of information that you have on your smart device. And so I would say that, you know, trustworthiness is more important than ever now too, because of that. So it's just the timing is terrible for state legislatures and for Congress to be thinking about making privacy features illegal when they probably just should be required.
I think those are great points. And, you know, I'm sympathetic. It's important to hear how these would impact the developers, but another group that I know you care passionately about is families. You know, I know you got your little one kicking around behind you. So how might these proposals impact families and parents and students as they start to become increasingly involved in this market earlier and earlier on in their life?
Well, a lot of the controls and a lot of the features that are sort of built into smart devices now are at the platform level. You know, it's a platform level feature that you can have a family account, and the parents can sort of figure out which apps should, you know, their kids should be able to download. That's probably true for schools as well, where they, you know, limit sort of the functionalities of devices at the admin level. So the platform level features sort of are called into question by especially the non-discrimination provisions of these bills, because it is essentially the platform getting in between the developer and the consumer. These are features that are really useful for developers, and they open up a lot of opportunities for developers. But nominally, they would run afoul of non-discrimination and prohibitions on keeping bad actors out. Because again, this is a platform level features, a platform managing the relationship.
I think those are all really important points. And as you said, you talked about a lot of these larger developers that are pushing these proposals. Why do you think they become so passionate about pushing these proposals? Epic bringing lawsuits themselves, and what do you think they stand to gain from them?
Yeah, you know, I think the origins of it are probably, as Jessica described, it's really about they reached a point where, you know, they were paying the commission. For our member companies, like I said, they rely a lot on the immediate global distribution. They rely a lot on the platform level privacy controls, the search functions, all those things that come along with you know, not having a whole lot of name recognition. Now, if you're a huge company and you've got your own name recognition, suddenly the the proposition of, you know, paying the fees is just not as attractive. You're not getting quite as much out of those services, I suppose. And so they reached probably a point where, you know, Tim Sweeney, I think, was emailing folks at Apple asking, you know, reduce our fee, please. And you know, after having got shut down, I think they reached a point where they thought maybe they had an antitrust claim. Now, the antitrust claim is not so good, right? Because they had to define the market as iOS, which has a lot of flaws. But that's the avenue that they went. And then, you know, seeing a lot of dead ends in the courts, probably under current law, I think that's probably why they went to legislatures, and why we've seen so many legislatures, I think 14, 15 in the States, looking to introduce something like this. And there really is, you know, for one reason or another, a lot of political will to take on big tech. That's also part of the reason we try to distinguish software platforms from social media, because all the problems that are being seen with each of those, and that are allegedly sort of attend each of those different sets of markets and those platforms are different, and the, you know, the remedies, you know, regardless of their merit, ought to be evaluated separately.
Yeah.
And so, but it's the tech lash.
Yeah, I'll say, Trace, can I pop in on this? Because I think Graham hit a really important point there that's sort of missed in this conversation. A lot of time when these state bills were brought, you know, state legislators meet right kind of after the beginning of the year, and Parler had just been kicked off a lot of app stores. And so I think there was a lot of political will to do something because they were upset that they were viewing that these companies were infringing on free speech in some way, shape, or form. And then you had a special interest group who felt they were paying too high of a fee, that had an answer to them that not only would have solved the political concern of, hey, we want a competitor to Twitter or some other social media company, and we feel that these companies are dealing with this in the wrong way, but also would have been beneficial to them. now, of course, Parler's back up on the Apple App Store, and it seems to have been, worked out that it's not really a controversy anymore. But at the time that these bills were coming up, there was certainly a lot of ill will. And as Jessica said, it's really hard to entangle a lot of these issues with the tech clash.
Yeah, I'm gonna speak out of turn too. Just to agree with both of you guys. I think that just a quick broader point about antitrust. This is a perfect example of how antitrust often ends up causing the same problem that it claims to be like solving. So if you think about sort of the trust aspect that Graham was talking about how these smaller developers, they might have a great idea, they might have an innovation. These are all good things, but what they don't have is trust. But they can piggyback on the Apple App Store and get that, right? As a consumer, I know that they've checked those boxes, and that's a lowering of a barrier to entry, right? If antitrust is supposed to be worried about, these big behemoths, they're too big, nobody can catch up, nobody can out innovate them. Well, this is the exact, you're causing that problem with this antitrust action, right? Like you're making sure that they can't scale up and kind of piggyback off Apple's trust, and that they figured that stuff out. And as a consumer, I know, okay, Apple's checked them out, so I can attach the trust I have with Apple to this new small startup guy. And that same argument goes for the distribution, the name recognition, all of those things. So if the larger pro antitrust action powers that be are concerned about barriers to entry, I think this is an excellent example of how antitrust action can be erecting those barriers to entry, not tearing them down. And I think that is a really important point to make.
I think that's true. I often talk about how there are very few terms of art that are more abused than barriers to entry in this space. And I think that's something worth highlighting. Jessica, I'll stay with you for a second then. What do you see as next on the horizon? Do you think we're going to see more states introduce legislation? Do you think the Open Markets Act will start to gain traction, more private lawsuits, potentially an FTC case? What do you see coming down the line?
Yes. Yes. I think that Lena Khan is off to the races at the FTC. And I mean, really, I cannot predict what will come out of that agency. They don't let us comment. They don't, they're just on their own trajectory. So I think you'll certainly see lots more coming out from there. I think that states will continue to be active on this and many other tech issues because Congress can't get anything over the finish line, and there's so many political points to be scored, right? So many clicks and so many checks to be collected by. If you scare people about tech, and then you stand up and say, "But I will protect you. You're a fearless politician." There's a lot of business to be done there. But I would just remind everyone, you can be a very good conservative and be against state regulatory action. In fact, I encourage you to be against it in this situation. That's why we started all over with a brand new constitution, because we tried that with the Articles of Confederation and it was a mess. Let's not try it again. That's why we have federal preemption. It's awesome. Now, of course, you can't get federal preemption because, once again, Congress can't get anything done. And if it were to move something like that, it would get a whole bunch of terrible things attached to it that I'm sure companies like Epic would spend a ton of money lobbying for. So there's a little bit of a uselessness to the whole cycle. I'm not sure how much will actually get instituted in law, because if you look at what's happening in the courts aren't really buying it yet, right? The Epic Apple case, the Facebook case being thrown out, now refiled. But the market definition is a problematic aspect for the other side of this, right? They have to prove that there's monopoly power, and then prove that it's being abused. And you can't get to those numbers in a lot of these cases. There's just not the percentage to say that these groups are monopolies or that they're harming consumers. So I think that there'll be continued attempts, and globally we've already seen Korea first out of the gate on the App Store laws. So I think that's an interesting test case to see how Apple reacts to that. What do they do? And France is super into that. If that is not a red flag for anyone on the fence in this issue, France is super into this idea and has been, for years. So let that give you pause. But the EU, the Digital Markets Act, that's going forward. I think that would encompass a lot of this. It's more broad, but I think this issue would get swept up in that. The UK, with its own regulatory agencies, will be looking at this too. I don't think this is the last we'll hear of it. But again, I hope that because when it all bears out, this really doesn't benefit consumers, parentheses, voters, that this really won't get taken into being the law of the land. But again, I think you'll see continued discussion on this and more federal level, state level, in the courts, internationally. None of this is going away.
Jessica, those are some awesome points, and they tee up something that we haven't discussed much of, but that is really important, and it's the international aspect of this. So regulations in South Korea could very well end up changing how app stores function across the world. Japan's recent efforts in cases with Apple resulted in a worldwide policy change. I want to turn this to Graham. Why do these sort of international efforts end up kind of boomeranging back and impacting American consumers? And what do you think that means for the future of digital governance, that an individual nation can have such a broad effect on the international economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a little bit like the GDPR effect, where that becomes just de facto the watermark that companies that have an international footprint will default sort of to the most rigorous and most strenuous set of regulations that they have to comply with. And so if a few different countries around the world, and they're important markets, start to adopt these sets of regulations, then that's the worst thing that a company has to comply with. They'll start to do that across other markets too, not unreasonably anticipating that something similar might come down in those other markets, and others will follow suit, because unfortunately, voters are often sort of rewarding elected folks for just taking on tech companies, finding a way to do it. This is just one way to do it. Just so happens to cost more than it benefits people, in our view. But that is, I think that's kind of why you see it sort of boomeranging and happening over here. And I think in other markets, like you said, Europe is starting to look at this. France is very interested. Their competition laws sort of protect competitors, and not just in the United States. It's really about the consumer and consumer welfare, and whether or not competition is harmed itself as well. It's a higher bar, and so the more policymakers here in the U.S. sort of look over in those other countries and see an opportunity, the more we should be concerned that the antitrust law in general is going to potentially start looking at protecting competitors that are aggrieved, in addition to or instead of consumers.
Especially if you look around, a lot of those, we're talking about like EU regulations or regulations in South Korea, there's clear business motives for those countries to bring these sorts of cases, right? Well, most of the time they're bringing them against American companies that are offering better products, that are outcompeting them in the market. They haven't been able to develop their own tech sector outside of Samsung, right, which we talk about having an app store as well that competes with the sort of default Android app store and the Apple app store. So what you're seeing a lot of times is regulators trying to help one company or another using their competition policy laws. And I think it really starts to unmoor what we view as the American antitrust standard, as you said, as helping consumers.
Jessica, I want to bounce back over to you real quick. So we've talked about these in a very holistic way, right? But there are a number of different proposals that we've actually been discussing. So one involves payment processing, another involves anti-discrimination, another involves side loading and third-party app stores. Which of these, as a free market type, I know you're generally opposed to almost all of them. But do you see any of these as more concerning than others, and which give you the greatest pause?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct. And first of all, let me just very quickly to highlight something Eric said that was important. I would not be able to continue my employment at CEI if I didn't point out the political cronyism and capture that's at work here. Don't forget about that. and just that the merits of letting all of these competitors fight it out and bump snouts in the marketplace is a lot more productive, a lot more timely, and a lot cheaper for taxpayers. So I have to say that in my contract. No, not really, but it's true. You know, I do view them all as sort of nonsense meddling, you know, all the different specifics, because all you need do is watch a hearing on any of these to get a sense of the expertise you're dealing with. You know, you're talking about a group of congressmen and senators who I don't know how many of them know how to check their own email, but I do know that I do not want them making decisions about the details of these business arrangements that are tried and failed and successful and not successful and go, you know, like we've talked about, Apple has one, Google has another. There's not like there's this monolith out there. And I don't feel like politicians micromanaging any of them is a benefit to consumers, right? I mean, these are complex decisions. And the other thing to be pointed out about the regulatory stuff and the action in the courts is it just can't keep pace with most industries, but especially in the technology space. There's a serious lag on almost all the tech issues I work on about what's happening, what's being innovated, and what Washington and in some state capitals they're worried about fussing with. So again, the saving grace is that Congress really can't get anything done. So I hope that's what goes the way of all of these different proposals. And I do feel like at the state level, I think that there was a huge lobbying campaign on a part of some of these companies, maybe Spotify, I don't know, to come in and say, hey, I have this great legislative proposal, you're gonna love it. And then, you know, as legislators will walk through the details of what would this really mean for their constituents, I think you started to see a little pullback. And I hope that that is something that we can also happens at the national level and keeps happening at the state level, because as Graham and Eric have talked about, the real world consequences of this for consumers is no bueno. So, you know, I hate to be predictable, but you're right. I find all of them to be bad ideas to lesser and more extent. But for the most part, it would just be better if Washington stayed out of this and the business interests that have skin in the game and the engineers are left to make these decisions, and that the consumers get to pick the winners, not who has the biggest lobbying firm or the snazziest PR video. I think that's always a mistake.
Before we get to our closing comments, Eric, I want to touch on an audience question that you brought up earlier, which is the two-sided nature of app stores in these markets. What do you mean when you say that?
I'm not sure specifically what you're getting at, but you know, I mean, obviously, I mean, you have to have both an app and an app developer, and they have to enter a contract to be on there. I mean, there's obviously a benefit for, you know, anybody who runs an app store, right? You get the reach that we were talking about, whether it's a video game console, whether it's a PC, whether it's an Android device. But you know, then there's the benefit of actually having apps on your platform, right? There's a reason that lots of device makers put app stores on there because they can, you know, raise revenue from doing so. So I mean, that's, you know, there's a benefit to, you know, all three sides if you look at consumers, app stores, and consumers. But it's possible I'm misunderstanding the question.
No, that was spot on. So I want to dive into sort of our closing remarks. I want to give you each 1 to 2 minutes just to leave with any high-level thoughts, any takeaways that you really want the audience to end with. And we'll start with you, Graham.
Thank you, Trace. I appreciate being here on behalf of the member companies. I think the takeaway for me is, you know, for policymakers that are evaluating proposals that would regulate the app stores or that would sort of take a sledgehammer in the antitrust law to discrimination or non-discrimination. Just think very carefully about what the impacts would be on the ability for app stores to perform the functions that my member companies demand from them, and that what the effects will be on removing the platforms from, you know, those functions on the marketplaces, especially when it comes to privacy and security. Now's a really bad time to start removing the privacy developments that have been created by market competition from from the toolbox. And so just my call is for policymakers just to be very careful about what those proposals would do to those core functionalities, and be just a little bit skeptical when somebody is coming to you and asking for these kinds of things on the app stores, and what those impacts would be, especially on small companies as opposed to the really big ones.
Eric, we'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, as the state person here, I would just kind of offer a warning to state lawmakers or those, or who want to talk to state lawmakers, that this is really just not the venue to deal with these issues. We talked a little bit about some of the international implications of things like GDPR or Samsung, or right now it's even looking like the EU might come out with regulations that deal with what charging cables have to look like. That if you talk about the implications that these are going to have, they're going to be across the world, and state lawmakers have a lot that they need to focus on, including getting their economies back from COVID, and I think making their states more attractive to tech investment, and understand what their role is going to be really important as these tech issues continue to expand and be part of state lawmakers' portfolios.
And as always, I try to save the absolute best for last. So we'll finally end with Jessica.
Oh, Trace, you charmer. I guess that it's the same old line that I always say, right? Like, tread very carefully as regulators. I think the biggest risk that antitrust presents is the innovation that it prevents. And I think that when you see areas of tech, like in many areas, and tech is no different, where there's a real problem, there's usually pretty good incentives for a market response to solve that problem. And I think that the only thing that gets in the way of that is you start regulating, tearing things apart that you don't fully understand, that response is in jeopardy. So, I actually don't think there's a huge problem with app stores. I think we have a couple different models out there. We have lots of choices out there, and it's working pretty well for everyone. To me, this is tech on tech violence. There's not much of a consumer outrage on this stuff. So I would just urge legislators, try to parse out your frustrations with these companies, politics and other content moderation and whatever other beef you had. That's a separate conversation that might be very worth having. But going in and micromanaging these contracts it's just going to sow chaos. So I would just say tread lightly, and there's real unintended harmful consequences, and they're to a lot of Graham's groups. We don't want that. We want more innovation, we want more growth, and we want creative destruction, right? We want the next big thing to roll over the big things we're worried about now. So don't get in the way of that.
Jessica, I'm apt to agree. So I just want to thank all of our great experts for being on this panel today. I also want to thank the audience for showing up, and anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about these issues, feel free to visit netchoice.org for more information. But I just want to thank you all for attending, and hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Trace. Thanks, everyone.